Hey, this is Jacob Eben. Thanks for tuning in. In this video, I wanted to discuss the ceremonial laws of the biblical commands of the written law. I wanted to speak generally about them because I think the popular view on the ceremonial laws is not in line with the scriptural view on them, with the law's view on them. There is a different frame which is present within the law, and I wanted to raise some points from the text in order for us to consider that. To start with, let's clarify what we are referring to when we think of ceremonial laws. There are actually some words in the text which appear to refer to that category of laws, and these are the two related Hebrew words, choq and chuqqah. Most biblical translations will just render them as command or statute or something along those lines, but if you look into it, you will see a general pattern that they are almost always referring to what would be called ritual commands or ceremonial laws, and this is also how some translators will render them. And so what are some examples of those ceremonial laws? What do those words encompass? Many of the commands which surround the Timna meeting or the tabernacle, the commanded holy structure of the law, the house of God, are referred to using these terms. That includes commands like the way the priests dress, the way they tend the lamps, the way they handle the sacrifices, the showbread, the bread of the presence, the establishment of a location for the Timna meeting in Deuteronomy 12, some of the laws of purification, and many similar commands. And we also see other commands included under these words, things like how certain oaths are handled, the observance of certain festivals, the not eating of any blood or any fat, which I would understand to be the suet or tallow, and certain laws regarding inheritance. For the most part, though, we are looking at the ritual worship done at the tent of meeting, the ceremonies which are commanded to be done in worship of God. And it's not just about atonement for sin. Many of these rituals were done for other reasons. Now, in our society today, we often have this idea of the seriousness of a crime. Whenever we think about a law and think about the violation of that law, the seriousness of the crime is often connected with the punishment of that crime. That is not necessarily laid out that way in the scriptural text, at least in any overall sense. And some people may suggest that all sins might be equal. It is true that a sin done in rebellion or in defiance, regardless of what it is a big problem which is treated equally. But let's consider this. In the biblical law, in the society following the biblical law, there are punishments associated with many of the crimes described. For example, stealing or theft is punished by the person repaying the victim of the crime and paying an additional on top of that. But it does not say that the person is kicked out of the community as a result. They are just required to do the restitution for their crime. On the other hand, there are commands which have the death penalty associated with them. Murder, for example, has the death penalty connected with it, the same with adultery, and the same with what might be described as kidnapping. So in some sense, we can see there are differences in the degrees of punishment for things. And while a person should always be following all of the law in full, it would appear that certain crimes of a severe nature will receive a more severe punishment. Both stealing and murder are wrong, but stealing from a person does not cause as much harm as murdering that person would. And this leads me to consider a theme in movies and TV which may relate to this, and it seems to me that the general teaching is that the end supposedly justifies the means. It seems like a very common trope that the hero, the good guy, he often has to break the rules in order to save the day or to do the thing which is supposedly the actual important thing. And I've even seen this in movies that have some type of spiritual theme or religious theme, or however one wants to put it, that a person can break the rules, even the scriptural rules, and then honor what they would see as the spirit of the rule, and then think it is supposedly good enough, that it supposedly didn't matter that they broke the actual law in the process, even if that law was commanded by the very God they claim to serve. And unfortunately, this sometimes permeates nonfiction as well. It is often associated with the no choice paradigm, the idea that a person has no choice in a situation but to do what they believe is wrong. And the reality is that there usually is a choice, and the person has just decided that there is something more important to them than right or wrong in that moment. And so the question I would have is, how does this idea of flexibility fit with the commands? How does this fit with the punishments associated with the commands? So if we can see the punishment for stealing is not nearly as severe as the punishment for murder, then what can we say about the punishments for breaking the ceremonial laws? Interestingly, whenever I did a survey of the text to see how many commands received the death penalty, or how many had a warning to do the commands so the person didn't die, I found that of the commands which received that level of punishment, about half of them were ritual commands, and it might even be more than half of those commands depending upon how you count it. If it were something that God was so flexible on and didn't really care if a person did or didn't do it, and if he only cared about the person's conscience in terms of the rituals, then would the death penalty, or would death, really be associated with it? In fact, if you look at many of the stories that are interspersed between the commands, the stories where people either are executed or they receive some sort of divine punishment, where they are struck dead or burned with divine fire, or the earth opens up and swallows them alive, you see that many people died because they were violating certain ceremonial commands. Even the two eldest sons of Aaron, the priest, died because they offered an unauthorized offering. Even though they were offering this offering to the correct Elohim, even though they were doing it in worship of God, it was an unauthorized offering and they were struck dead. There is a level of seriousness associated with these ceremonies in terms of the consequences of doing otherwise. And that does not reflect the flexibility we would expect, at least by the standard of the popular view or the cultural view. Also, if you consider the totality of the commands of the law given through Moses, and if you were only looking at the commands and you were not counting all the stories and all the narrative which is interspersed throughout the commands in these books, we are easily looking at half of the commands being just about the ceremonies. You're looking at about a third of the book of Exodus being about building the tent of meeting and about the priesthood of Aaron, and there are only a few other chapters in Exodus otherwise where commands are gone into in a significant amount, and most of them are just narrative. And then you're looking at most of the book of Leviticus and most of the commands in the book of Numbers, and there are also chapters in Deuteronomy dedicated to those subjects. As one of my friends has pointed out on this channel, you would think that if God saw fit to say something over and over and to explain it thoroughly, then it is something he probably thinks is important and wants us to think is important. And these are the very commands which are most frequently said to be forever, eternal, enduring, the Hebrew word olam. Now, it is true that we are in a situation today, right now, where most of these commands cannot be followed, and many of them cannot even be observed in any sense, because the tent of meeting is an integral part of most of them, and it has not been around for a long time. It is clear that by the time of the book of Samuel, the descendant of Korah, that things had already gone off the rails completely, and the priests were not following God's commands at the tent of meeting, if that is indeed what that was. And some people may point out today that maybe there is a difference in whether we actually need to do these things anymore, but I want to point out that with things like sacrifice, it's not all about just forgiving sin. If we look at a number of verses in Leviticus, like Leviticus 21:8, we can see that these sacrifices are referred to as the food of your God. Now that may seem kind of weird at first, and may seem like a very foreign idea to us, especially if we haven't been spending a lot of time focusing on what the law says, and understanding what the law says for itself, about itself. That may seem somewhat weird, but it is indeed stated there, and it is in other verses as well. And with some of the offerings and ceremonies, there is no connection with forgiving sin. With some of them, there is a connection with providing atonement or providing covering or purification, but with some of them, it says nothing about any of that. It is a part, ultimately, of the commanded worship of God, regardless of what we personally might get out of it. The question is, why shouldn't these things matter? Why shouldn't it be important the way that God wants us to worship Him according to the commands? The sad thing is that there are even stories in later books, which are not the law, which try to convince people that these commands don't matter. There is a priesthood from Judah in the latter part of the books of Samuel, despite the laws about the priesthood of Aaron, and there are even people eating the showbread despite it being called the Holy of Holies and reserved for Aaron and his sons as an everlasting commandment. And there is even another mention of that eating the showbread incident given as if it were proof of how breaking commands is supposedly okay. We have to wonder, though, what does the law itself say? What did God command on that? And the answer to that, as we know fully, is clear. In Deuteronomy 30, it says that in the future, the people will return to God and will return to doing His commandments. It says they will listen to His voice again. It even says they will return to doing His ceremonial laws again. It uses the very same word we've been considering from the beginning of the video. The people will return to the commands of the law again, and they will follow them. The commanded tent of meeting will be built again, and the commanded priesthood of Aaron will serve again. And I believe that at that time, a light such as you have never seen will appear. It will be as if it has always been. Everyone will know Him. His name will fill the earth.